Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore the church and Freemasonry. What I want to look at is really the history of that relationship. Where do things stand today? This is oftentimes something that comes up in terms of why do certain religions have issues with Masonry, and I want to try and explore some of those ideas today, because it's something we don't talk about that often. The relationship between the Catholic Church and Freemasonry is one marked by deep tension, official condemnation, and a complex evolution over the centuries. Today, I'm going to try and walk you through some of the key moments in history that have really defined this relationship, from the Church's earliest reactions to modern interpretations. Understanding this history not only illuminates the formal stance of the Church, but also the underlying reason for the conflict, and it becomes particularly pertinent today as I'm recording. The College of Cardinals is planning the conclave because Francis has recently passed, and they're going to be picking a new pope who may have different views. We have no idea at this point. Let's get to the origins of the conflict. To begin with, we have to understand the context in which Freemasonry, of course, emerges. During the Enlightenment, this period around the early 18th century, the early 1700s, Freemasonry has evolved at this point from medieval stonemasons into a fraternal organization, mostly looking at Enlightenment philosophies, ideas of reason, liberty, fraternity, and the pursuit of moral virtue. And they're doing this in a place in England where they had been through these series of religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. And Freemasonry very much is looking at things and saying, you know what? We're sick of the hierarchy having these battles. There must be a better way. And that's where a lot of the universality of Masonry would appear to come from. Freemasonry tended to attract members across social and religious boundaries, often uniting men of different Christian denominations, a huge problem in England at the time. We're just after the Reformation, a couple hundred years, these wars have been ongoing. Sometimes even different faiths are allowed under a common system of morality, albeit one that did not depend on any particular religious authority. From the Church's perspective, and here when I say the Church, I'm always referring to the Catholic Church, this is immediately problematic. Freemasonry's emphasis on religious indifference, the idea that all religions are equally valid paths to truth, was seen as a direct threat to Catholic doctrine and many other faiths, which holds that salvation could only come through the Church, through Catholicism in this case. Moreover, the secretive nature of Masonic meetings raises suspicions about their aims, their loyalties, what's going on behind closed doors. The first time we see a formal stance is 1738, so we're only 21 years after the first Grand Lodge, when Pope Clement XII puts out a papal bull. Now, as I get into these papal bulls, they are all titled in Latin. Yes, I took 4 years of Latin. No, I don't know how to pronounce it half the time because no one actually does. There's Church Latin, there's Oxford Latin, and both of them are kind of guesses at what it would actually sound like. But the papal bull is called, and bear with me here, In Eminenti Apostolatus Specula. This document explicitly prohibits Catholics from joining Masonic lodges. Pope Clement condemned the secrecy of the lodges, their potential to undermine both civil and ecclesiastical or church authority, and the relativistic religious attitudes they seem to promote. In other words, they are promoting religious ideas that are outside the hierarchy of religion, which makes perfect sense when you consider Masonry's development during the Enlightenment and the religious wars. In Eminati stated in no uncertain terms that any Catholic who became a Freemason would incur automatic excommunication, meaning that the individual was excommunicated by the very act itself without any further declaration. At this time, it's important to note Freemasonry was still in its infancy, and the papal bull was issued before any distinct national brands of Freemasonry had fully formed. We don't see the complete national Grand Lodges that we see today. We don't even in England at the time, we see that split between the ancients and the moderns. Thus, this condemnation applied broadly without any distinction among different Masonic obediences that would later evolve. In other words, there are no appendant bodies at the time. They're not saying, well, this body is bad, but this body is fine. It's just a blanket statement. Now, in 1751, another pope, Pope Benedict XIV, reaffirms Clement's position with his own bull called Providas Romanorum. Again, he warns of the dangers that secret societies pose to both the church and the state. In these early documents, the church's objections center less on wild conspiracy and more on theological and political concerns. Again, the idea of religious relativism, this idea of the universality, secrecy, and the independence from hierarchical authority that Freemasonry represented. The church's argument is essentially that since Freemasonry exists outside of religion, then it must also exist outside of politics. And they're making that argument to try and strengthen it, try and get the rulers at the time on board with their thinking. Throughout the 18th century, other popes reiterated these positions. We see Popes Pius VII, Leo XII, and Pius VIII each issue documents condemning Masonic activity, usually echoing concerns about revolutionary ideals and the erosion of Catholic social order. Now, the revolutionary ideals are correct. I mean, at the end of the day, elements of the American Revolution and the lead up to it do, of course, develop in or around Masonic lodges in some cases. So I can see the argument there. It's that hierarchical argument that we keep coming back to, that idea that we can't have universalism because you can only find salvation within, in this case, the church. Catholicism, although there are other faiths who feel the same way. By the 19th century, so we're in the 1800s, Freemasonry had become closely associated in the minds of many Catholic leaders with liberal political movements. I'm going to stop there. When I say liberal political movements, what I mean is things like the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Liberal in this case meaning political ideals that would change the world. And of course, Masonry held many of those, many of which we've actually discussed to some degree on this podcast. But with liberal political movements that sought to reduce the influence of the church in public life, which isn't actually the case, but that is how they are perceiving things. In Europe, Masonic lodges were often linked with a push for secular governance, constitutional democracies, and a separation of church and state, all things that Masonry was in favor of at one time. Causes that many in the Vatican viewed as existential threats. In fact, Leo XIII provides an encyclical. Now, papal bulls and encyclicals are the equivalent of edicts. They're coming out, and this is the formal stance that they will have during the time of that papacy. But he puts out an encyclical called Humanum Genus in 1884, which is perhaps the most detailed and comprehensive condemnation of Freemasonry in Catholic history. In this encyclical, Leo XIII describes the Masonic movement as a rival religion, a, quote, kingdom of Satan set up in opposition to the kingdom of God. Leo XIII outlines several accusations. I'm going to take these from the encyclical. Freemasonry promotes naturalism, the belief that human reason without divine revelation was sufficient for understanding truth and morality. He argues that it sought to undermine Catholic education and replace it with secular ideals. He argues that it worked to diminish the role of the church in society, and it fostered religious indifference and moral relativism. In other words, the idea that morality is relative to one's religion or culture rather than some kind of overarching moral ideal. In Humanum Genus, Leo XIII made it clear no Catholic could be a Mason without separating himself from the church and forfeiting hope of salvation. When we get a little bit further, so we're in the period of World War I, 1917, we start to see some codified elements within what's called canon law. Canon law within the church deals with the practical elements. It would be the equivalent of the code. Whereas when we talk about doctrine, that's usually referring to belief. So canon law is the specific code of the church and how things will be run, but doesn't typically deal with belief as such. But this is going to get a little confusing, and just bear with me here. The church's stance will be codified in a legal form with the 1917 Codus Iuris Canonica, the first universal code of church law. Now, Canon 2335 of the 1917 Code explicitly states that Catholics who joined Masonic associations or other similar groups that, quote, plot against the church were automatically excommunicated. This codification was significant because it gave legal teeth to centuries of papal bulls and encyclicals. It's the equivalent of taking it from an edict and putting it in the code. It made the penalty clear and placed it firmly within the framework of the church. As we move into the 20th century, things do start to change, particularly after Vatican II, also known as the Second Vatican Council, between 1962 and 65. Many Catholics and Masons alike wondered whether the church's stance might soften. Vatican II emphasized dialogue with the modern world, religious liberty, and ecumenism. The documents of Vatican II did not mention Freemasonry at all, leading some to speculate that the church might be rethinking its opposition. However, the church's position remains largely unchanged. The confusion grew in this post-council period because some bishops' conferences and individual theologians proposed that Freemasonry is simply no longer a threat. Some argued that modern Masonry, at least in many countries, was no longer anti-clerical or conspiratorial in any way. In response to this, the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, there's a whole history of what that office is, but I won't get into it here, issued a Declaration of Masonic Associations in 1983, signed by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later becomes Pope Benedict XVI. The Declaration on Masonic Association made the church's stance quite clear. Quote, "The church's negative judgment in regard to Masonic associations remains unchanged because their principles have always been considered irreconcilable with the doctrine of the church. Therefore, membership in them remains forbidden. The faithful who enroll in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion, although it should be noted that unlike our previous canon law, this statement, the Declaration of Masonic Association, simply says may not receive communion, does not call for excommunication. This declaration was issued shortly before the promulgation of a new canon law, which is where things get really confusing. Interestingly, the 1983 Canon Code does not specifically mention Freemasonry. Instead, Canon 1374 states the following: "A person who joins an association which plots against the church is to be punished with a just penalty. One who promotes or takes office in such an association is to be punished with an interdict." Because Freemasonry is not explicitly named, some thought the prohibition had been lifted. However, the 1983 declaration clarified the omission of the word Freemasonry was deliberate because the church was concerned not just with Freemasonry, but any association whose principles are incompatible with Catholic teaching. Nevertheless, Freemasonry is still very much included. Throughout history, several recurring themes explain this prohibition. First, religious indifference. The idea that one religion is as good as another is fundamentally opposed to Catholic doctrine, also opposed to several other religions as well. Here I'm just focusing on one, Catholicism. Second, naturalism. Freemasonry's emphasis on human reason and moral autonomy, apart from divine revelation, conflicts with Catholic understandings of faith and grace. Makes sense again because we are coming out of the Enlightenment. Masonry really does reflect Enlightenment ideals, as we've covered last season. And so that makes sense. Now, does it make sense that Catholicism sees that as a threat? Well, that depends on your views of the modern world, I suppose. Secrecy and oaths. The church is suspicious of secret societies, especially those that bind members by oaths that may conflict with Catholic moral obligations. By the way, it never states at any point what in the obligation is a problem, simply that an oath or obligation is a problem, which would lead to an issue for all of those various offices that we see, for example, in the United States, where we see oaths and obligations. And the question of secrecy, well, everyone wants to know what's happening behind closed doors. They don't know that sometimes we just argue about light bulbs. Political activities. Historically, Freemasonry was seen as an agent of liberal, secular, and anti-clerical movements. I would question the anti-clerical. I'm not sure where they're getting that, but liberal and secular, sure, I can see that. I would concede it. Because we see, as I've said, Freemasonry involved in everything from some of the ideals that we see in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to ideals that we see as the foundation of the United States, ideas that would change the world. Even abolitionism is strongly supported by Masonry before it becomes strongly supported by the public in general. So it makes sense why they see these as issues. It also makes sense, there's a certain amount of accuracy in them. I would argue maybe misinterpretation, but that's up to you. Today, we see a very different landscape. It's important to note that Freemasonry today is a highly diverse institution. We see a massive variety in how Masonry is practiced from country to country. In some places, lodges maintain very secular attitudes. In others, Freemasonry emphasizes charity, personal development, and civic service without any really overt political or religious agendas, which I would argue is the situation in Wisconsin. However, the church maintains that the underlying philosophical and theological incompatibilities still exist, regardless of the particular character of local lodges. In summary, the Catholic Church's stance on Freemasonry has remained remarkably consistent, although arguably based on a misinterpretation of what Masonry is. Despite changes in society and Freemasonry itself, the Church holds that the principles of Freemasonry are simply irreconcilable. Membership in the craft remains forbidden for Catholics under pain of grave sin, and Catholics who join lodges are instructed not to receive Holy Communion without first repenting and making amends. Understanding this history, filled with papal bulls, encyclicals, canon law, and declarations, helps us appreciate why the Church views this issue with such seriousness and why the prohibition remains in place. It also helps us understand where we came from and why we see not just the Catholic Church, but, for example, elements of the Lutheran faith, elements of several other faiths, taking issue because we exist outside of the hierarchy of religion. If we were a purely Catholic society, then that might be different. And we see that that's the case, since there are purely Catholic societies out there that are acceptable by the papacy, even though their ideals are pretty darn similar. So, from the Catholic perspective, it's because we believe in this universalism. We believe in this universalism because we developed in the Enlightenment when Protestantism and Catholicism were at war in England and in Northern Europe. And so we tried to create something different, something better, something universal, Masonry universal. And those ideals of universality are what set us at odds with many religions, because many religions believe at the end of the day that if you don't believe in their faith, then you cannot find salvation. Hence the existence of purgatory in the Catholic tradition, place where you go if you had no choice. Limbo in the Catholic tradition. So, at the end of the day, my purpose here is not to say that the church is necessarily incompatible. That is their view. That is not necessarily the view of Masonry. My purpose here is to answer the question, why is it that these religions take issue with us? And by focusing on one, Catholicism, we can tease out many of the issues that we would see from other religions, other Protestant religions, for example, that also take issue with Freemasonry. Sometimes it is worth exploring the hard topics, because those are the rabbit holes that are going to give us the most instruction. They're going to be the most helpful to us in the long run and help us understand what the arguments are. After all, you can't possibly partake in an argument if you don't understand the other side. So I ask you, understand the other side so you can better understand yourself. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Leakey, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.